Well, thank you for being back. My apologies, the last break I advertised as a coffee tea break. It ended up being an ice water cookie break. My apologies for that, but we still appreciate you coming back on time. We're going to finish today with two very special opportunities. The first is our Global Democracy panel that I'll introduce in just a moment. But the second is immediately after this panel has concluded at 5 o'clock, we're going to just take a quick stand, stay in place, take a break, because at 5 o'clock we have the opportunity for a special unveiling of a new bust in the Dodd Center for Human Rights dedicated to Senator Christopher J. Dodd. So we're going to have just a couple of minutes of remarks from people before we go out into the reception area and admire the bust, and we're going to close with a beautiful reception that I promise will have more than coffee and tea, but should be worth you staying around for that. Again, we appreciate your attendance throughout the day. We've had full rooms and great engagement, and thank you for that. The success of any program like this is completely dependent on you being here and you being engaged, and you've done that, and we're deeply appreciative. As you've experienced throughout the day, if you've been here for the previous sessions, we've had a major focus on Ukraine. Given the current crisis in Ukraine, we've talked about issues of memory, issues of accountability, issues of justice. But today's final panel, we want to broaden the focus beyond Ukraine to begin to speak about challenges to global democracy around the world. If you were here at the beginning of today, when I introduced the summit, I said the reason for our summit, the reason for us being here is that every area, every region of the globe is experiencing rollbacks in democracy, whether it's called democratic backsliding, democratic retreat, democratic deconsolidation. Democracy is backpedaling in region after region after region around the world. So we're very pleased to have the opportunity to think through some of these regional and global challenges with a very distinguished panel. And it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague who is moderating the panel, Dr. Kathy Lieball. Kathy is director of the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute and associate professor of social work and human rights at the University of Connecticut. Most importantly, at least to me, Kathy is a remarkable colleague and partner to work with in the Dodd Center. She's a tireless worker. She is incredibly insightful, psychologically astute on a wide range of things. And one of the great benefits of working here at UConn already for me has been all the tremendous things I've learned from just a few months of working together with Kathy. So please join me in welcoming Kathy.
Welcome. For those of you who've been with us since this morning, thank you for your extraordinary attention and focus through what may be a long but hopefully very engaging day. And I couldn't be more delighted to be able to introduce our speakers for the third panel and to also moderate the conversation. And so the panel that we're going to embark on is titled Global Democracy and Human Rights, and we will be examining various facets of the ongoing erosion of democratic institutions, practices, and norms around the globe. Panelist remarks will focus on the global challenges to democracy, exploring ways in which the promotion and protection of human rights can respond to those challenges. And so I'll briefly introduce each panelist and then share with you a question that I posed to them. Alice Wairimu Nderitu of Kenya is the Undersecretary General and the Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide. She's a recognized voice in the field of peace building and violence prevention, having led as mediator and senior advisor in reconciliation processes around the world. She served as commissioner of the National Cohesion and Integration Commission in Kenya, as well as founding member and co-chair of the Uwiano Platform for Peace, a prevention agency linking early warning to early response. She was also one of the founders of Community Voices for Peace and Pluralism, a network of African women professionals preventing, transforming, and solving violent ethnic, racial, and religious conflicts worldwide. She was unable to attend in person today, and she'll explain that in a short set of remarks that she makes to the summit participants. She finally has been able to make a long-awaited trip in her role at the UN to visit the field in Darfur. Harsh Mander is the chairperson of the Center for Equity Studies in Delhi, India. That particular center is devoted to the analysis and development of public policy and law for justice and rights of disadvantaged groups. He convenes and edits the annual India Exclusion Report, and to counter rising hate violence and lynching within India, he leads the national initiative called the Karwan-e-Mohabbat, or Caravan of Love, for atonement, solidarity, healing, conscience, and justice. He is a prolific writer. His some 25 books include most recently Burning Pyres, Mass Graves, and A State That Failed Its People, India's COVID Tragedy. The Peace Research Institute in Oslo has included Mander in its 2022 shortlist of people recommended for the Peace Prize. Kelly Zvobgo is an assistant professor of government at William & Mary, a faculty affiliate at the Global Research Institute, a founder and director of the International Justice Lab, and also a beloved member of the editorial board of the Journal for Human Rights. Her research engages questions of human rights, transitional justice, and international law and courts. And she's won several awards for her work, including the Best Dissertation in Human Rights, both from the American Political Science Association and the International Studies Association. Zaid Eyadat is director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan, and he's former vice president of International Affairs, Quality and Accreditation, and member of the Royal Committee to Modernize the Political System in Jordan. He is also a member of Jordan Economic Vision 2030. Eyadat is professor of political science and international relations, as well as the founding dean of the Prince Hussein School of International Studies at the University of Jordan. He has a particular interest in conflict and peace studies, human rights, Middle East politics, and refugee and migration issues. And finally, Mariana Salazar Albornoz is the Academic Programs Associate of the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, and professor at Universidad Iberoamericana. She served as a member of the Inter-American Judicial Committee of the Organization of American States, where she was rapporteur for privacy and data protection and for international law applicable to cyberspace. She worked for more than a decade at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, where she served as the coordinator of international law, the director for international humanitarian and criminal law, and the director for economic, social, and cultural rights. So we have an extraordinarily distinguished panel. I have asked them to each open with remarks for 10 minutes in response to the following question. In the region and space in which you work, what do you see as the most significant challenges to democracy? How can the promotion and protection of human rights respond to these challenges? After they've spoken initially, I'll follow up with one question, and then we'll immediately open to the audience for additional questions. We start with Alice's message, which she just recorded in the last day or so to share with the group. And then we'll move to Kelly, Zaid, Harsh, Kelly, Zaid, and Mariana.
Ladies and gentlemen, first I must say how deeply regretful I am as I'm not able to join you in person today at the inaugural Human Rights Summit of the Dodd Center for Human Rights at the University of Connecticut on the topic of human rights and the global assault on democracy. I begin by thanking you for awarding the Thomas J. Dodd Prize in International Justice and Human Rights to the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center in Kyiv, Ukraine. I had confirmed my in-person participation to Professor James Waller, who is inaugural Dodd Chair of Human Rights at the University of Connecticut, whom I met more than a decade ago as a participant in a seminar for which he was lead instructor, held annually at the Auschwitz-Birkenau German Nazi concentration and extermination camp. I also regret not being able to come and reconnect with my sister, Alexandra Matvichuk, who leads the non-profit Center for Civil Liberties and was the recipient of the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize, the first Nobel Prize in history awarded to a Ukrainian citizen or organization. Alex and I are both alumni of the ECITAS 2007 International Human Rights Training Program, IHRTP, in Montreal, Canada, and I look forward to hearing her speak. This year marks an important milestone for human rights. It is the 75th anniversary of two important documents adopted by the United Nations soon after its establishment and that have played a key role in framing the understanding we have today of human rights, and in particular protection against the most serious forms of identity-based violence. The first is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted on 10 December 1948. The second is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, adopted one day before on 9 December 1948, which forms the cornerstone of our collective work on genocide prevention. So the convention was drafted in the aftermath of the Holocaust, recognizing that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, was a crime under international law. The term genocide had been coined just a few years before in 1994 by Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who wanted to put a name to the mass killings and violence against communities based on their identity. Lemkin went on to contribute significantly to the realization of the Genocide Convention, expressing the hope that it would become a living force in world society. Making the Genocide Convention a living force in world society is the theme of this year's 75th anniversary. We are living at a time when societies are more diverse, yet intolerance keeps rising. We see growing support for nationalist and populist movements that encourage bigotry and hatred. We are seeing the incitement to violence against individuals and groups based on their identity. We see violence that carries the risk factors for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Despite the groundbreaking commitment by all member states in 2005 to protect populations from these crimes, we have not seen a reduction in these crimes, and the gap between these words of commitment and the experience of vulnerable populations around the world keeps growing. The theme, a living force in world society, recognizes that the fact that although the commitment to never again was made in 1948, in too many situations it has remained unfulfilled. My mandate as the United Nations Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide was established in response to the failure of the United Nations and the international community to prevent the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and in Srebrenica against the Bosniak Muslims in the 1990s. More recently, we've seen grave violations committed against the Rohingya in Myanmar and the Yazidi in Iraq, to mention just a few, that could amount to genocide. Making the convention a living force in society means learning from these failures and backing up the commitment of never again with concrete action. This is not always an easy task. While we know the warning signs and have the tools for responding, we are still faced with many situations where populations are at risk. Too often, lack of political will or deadlocks at national, regional, or international level prevent the convention's full realization, with devastating consequences for the victims. So this year's theme, A Living Force in World Society, is also an invitation to examine the progresses that have been made and that we can learn from, and from which we can identify new opportunities for engagement. So for example, the Genocide Convention has helped accountability mechanisms established both at national and international levels, including the International Criminal Court, who have used or continue to use the definition of genocide included in the convention. The link between the convention and the broader human rights system is perhaps strongest in the prevention obligation of the Genocide Convention. The UDHR and the human rights treaties that followed, when implemented, contribute to prevention by ensuring non-discrimination, equality before the law, and the right to remedy, among others. Engagement on human rights is also where we see many of the positive examples of prevention, including adoption of national laws to protect minorities and through initiatives that promote inclusion. I began my career as a human rights educator teaching international legal instruments, UN declarations and conventions. I worked in contexts where often commitments to addressing concerns such as torture, enforced disappearances, specific targeting of ethnic and religious communities for killing, and the rights of minorities had not been translated into law. In cases where governments had ratified the international human rights treaties but not put in place domestic measures and legislation compatible with their treaty obligations and duties, I taught about the mechanisms and procedures for individual and group complaints available at the regional and international level. This, however, was never enough, and the people I worked among could hardly apply the international instruments I was teaching to end the ethnic and religious violence the communities were going through. What helped these communities was when I began making the connections in my teaching of human rights violations as both causes and results of violence. This laid the foundation for peace building and the mediation of armed conflict work that I later did. Human rights principles became the foundation for the work I did as a mediator. It was, however, Professor Wallace's teaching in Auschwitz-Birkenau that made me understand that peace-building approaches were not sufficient in preventing atrocity crimes. As we discuss the global assault on democracy, we must see the links between prevention, access to human rights that encompasses many aspects that include environmental considerations, gender, social and economic dynamics, cultural rights and development, among others. This is because preventing atrocity crimes is such a complex issue, entailing multi- and interdisciplinary lenses of human rights. We face many negative trends. However, we are also seeing cause for hope in the incredible work of national, regional, and local champions. We also believe that enhancing understanding of the risk factors for atrocity crimes can bring us closer to preventing these crimes. But this is not only a task for my office. Everyone in society can play a role in atrocity prevention. For this reason, the framework of analysis developed by my office is a public tool, and I encourage each of you to mainstream its use in your daily work. Analysis, however, is useless without action. We know well atrocities early warning signs, yet too often the political will and resolve to act remains largely insufficient. The fact that so many atrocities are being perpetrated even while we are meeting here demonstrates that the willingness to prevent is still insufficient, and the price to be paid for this is inestimable. I encourage all of you to join my office in this year's commemoration of the Genocide Convention by reflecting on its legacy and how it can remain an active force for prevention. I thank you for your attention.
So thank you. I traveled to be with you from the other end of the world, and I wanted to be here, but it was difficult. It was difficult for many reasons. Just a few days before I left, there's a festival where idols. It's a Hindu festival where idols are placed on every street corner, and there's sacred food that is placed around. In Delhi itself, a young Muslim man, mentally challenged, went and picked up a banana and ate from one of these sites. He was caught, tied to a tree, and beaten to death. His father, when I met him, he said he ate a banana and they killed him. A couple of weeks earlier, a uniformed police person entered into a railway a train, and he first shot dead his supervisor, and then, with a lot of time, he went from compartment to compartment, found 3 men of obviously Muslim identity, and he shot them to death, and gave a little speech on social media. The next morning, a young Muslim colleague of mine, she came into my office and she broke down. And she said, I couldn't sleep since I heard this news, because that man could have been my father, he could have been my brother. I felt compelled to then write an article which was the speech that our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, did not make. The speech that he did not make to reassure, maybe we have 200 million Muslim people in India. I was thinking maybe in 1 million homes the same conversation would be going on. And there was no official condemnation. There was very little public outrage. And incidents of this kind of hate violence have become so routine that people barely notice and we move on. India is today fast transforming into a dark and violent place of unfreedom, of fear and hate. Gregory Stanton, founder of Genocide Watch, we've been talking about genocide, he predicted that India under Mr. Modi shows early signs of an impending genocide. The US Holocaust Museum went further to estimate that India is the country second most likely to witness a genocide. And democracy is faltering badly. But the world, particularly the global north, is determined to look away and to continue to look away. India is 1/6 of humankind. And if democracy and the example of how you live together with diversity breaks down in India, the world will be much poorer. Let me talk about very quickly, and I know somebody's going to show me 10 minutes there, and I'm carefully not looking in that direction. I'll talk about 3 quick things about why democracy, I feel, is in such peril. The first is the targeting of India's religious minorities, especially Muslims. There's almost the state in undisguised war with its Muslim citizens. Religious and the highest political leaders make open calls regularly for genocide, for mass rape, and nothing happens to them. Social media is rife with toxic hate prejudice. There's an epidemic of lynching. Groups routinely gather and beat to death mostly Muslim men around allegations of cow slaughter or this strange new idea of what they call love jihad. This is a fantasy that good-looking Muslim young men are picked up and trained to attract Hindu girls, who obviously have nothing in their minds and no agency and so on. So this idea is so bizarre, but it's now being spoken about by chief ministers. People are being rounded up for interreligious marriages. There's the near total ejection of Muslims from political participation. The ruling party is proud of the fact now that it doesn't have a single member of parliament or in any legislature who is Muslim, and this is we're talking about 200 million people being represented. There were changes in India's citizenship law, which for the first time gave lesser rights to people just of this one religious identity. There are attacks on the livelihoods of Muslims, there are attacks on religious and cultural practices, their namaz, the hijab, and so on. There's the rewriting of history to erase all the positive contributions that Muslims have made into our culture, and I could go on. I spent a year studying what happened in Nazi Germany, and I was terrified about how to observe how close what is happening in India is to those early years of Nazi Germany. But my biggest lesson that I took away was that the horror of Nazi Germany was not Hitler. The horror of Nazi Germany was ordinary people and their radicalization and their participation. And I think that is what we are seeing unfolding. What we're seeing, we're not going to see a Nazi kind of Holocaust, something much closer to what is happening with the Rohingya. Hannah Arendt said citizenship is the right to have rights. And I see what is happening. Already Muslims in India have are losing their right to have any rights. You can talk about genocide, you can do anything, and you'll get away with it. There are also very strong signs of Jim Crow's America, where lynching, the numbers were never large, but they were performative acts of lynching, which were designed to put fear in the hearts of every African American. It was performative then because crowds used to gather, families used to gather, it used to be picnics, people used to, in fact, buy as souvenirs, index fingers and so on. Now it's performative because it is always videotaped by the perpetrators and circulated and massively consumed across the country. Second, the crisis is the rapid collapse of India's democratic institutions, including the enfeeblement of parliament and the political opposition. They mount criminal charges, grave criminal charges, and arrest anybody who's vocal in the opposition. There's the declining independence of the election commission. The law has been changed actually to allow, for the first time, anonymous political funding, and 90% of it is going to the ruling party. The judiciary is not consistent in its protection of human rights and minority rights, and there's the abject caving in of the independent civil services. And the third cluster of worry is in the crushing of dissent. In politics, in civil society, in academia, there's a complete corporate takeover of the media and its dramatic transformation. India was very proud of its independent and vocal and argumentative media. They've become, transformed almost across the board into cheerleaders of the ruling regime and purveyors of hate and prejudice, and their refusal to hold the government accountable. There's the systematic destruction of the liberal arts university. There's the use of anti-terror, sedition, money laundering laws against dissenting voices, intellectuals, activists, journalists, political opposition. People have been in prison for years without trial. And I actually have now so many cases against me across terror, money laundering, whatever, so many that I could spend this life, and Hindus believe in yet another life, so the next life also in prison. And so this is really a framework, and I lost track of my time, and so I won't tell you what we're trying to do to confront this. But I did feel that the rest of the world is simply turning its face away, and we never learn from history. If other governments had intervened much earlier in Nazi Germany, maybe millions of lives could have been saved. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to the Dodd Center and Jim for the invitation to share a little bit about the global assault on democracy from my vantage point from the area where I do work. This is a little bit different than what I had promised Jim, so hopefully you're still pleased with me afterwards. So like Kathy mentioned, I specialize in human rights, transitional justice, and international law and organization with an interest in international courts in particular. And today I'm going to talk about how these areas relate to the global assault on democracy, focusing on the latter two, transitional justice and international law and organization, and more specifically, international courts. So, transitional justice, echoing Anna, who kind of provided a very nice transition for me in this panel, is how states deal with the past. And they do this through a range of policies, measures, processes, institutions, collectively known as transitional justice, built on 4 pillars. Now, Anna is a lawyer, and so perhaps naturally started with justice. I am a political scientist, and so I start with truth, then justice, then reparations, and then guarantees of non-repetition, which in my area has been operationalized as institutional reforms. So consistent with DDR, so disarmament, demobilization, and rehabilitation, but then also fundamental changes to the legal and institutional context that enabled abuses to occur in the first place. So truth, justice, reparations, guarantees of non-repetition, or institutional reforms. And within this area, I've done a lot of work on truth commissions, which were also mentioned at the end. So let me just provide a quick definition so we are all working on the same plane. So truth commissions are temporary bodies created by governments to investigate abuses in the past, to establish a system of harm over a period of time, and to do so while engaging with the affected population. And so there are lots of bodies that might seem like truth commissions. I know students often ask me on campus, is the January 6th Commission a truth commission, or other such bodies? And I'm like, well, it's more of a commission of inquiry. But anyway, truth commission, temporary government-sponsored body, investigates events in the past, establishes a pattern of harm over time, and does so while engaging with the affected population. I mentioned truth commissions because they are one useful lens through which to understand how autocrats are co-opting institutions initially designed to support processes of democratization and democratic consolidation. So I have an article that's coming out early next year in Human Rights Quarterly called Co-opting Truth, explaining quasi-judicial institutions in authoritarian regimes. And this paper is great for lots of reasons, or rather has been challenging for lots of reasons, including colleagues not wanting to talk about autocratic truth commissions because then they're not true truth commissions, right? And we need to have a commission on truth to establish the truth of truth commissions. Sorry. Anyways, nothing in the definition of truth commission says that they have to be created under conditions of democratic transition or within established democracies, right? And so these bodies are being used in different parts of the world, including in situations of autocratic rule. And it's really important that we take them seriously and study them to understand whose interests they are intended to serve and what are not only the conditions from which they arise, but also their inputs, outputs, and consequences. So in this article, Co-opting Truth, with a couple of colleagues, Daniel Solomon at Georgetown and Shauna Gluli at the Catholic University of Chile, we apply the standard definition of truth commissions to every such body that looks like a truth commission since 1970, and discover that 1 in 3 truth commissions globally have been created under conditions of autocratic rule. And that is an important finding that is descriptively, just so that we know the landscape of transitional justice, but then also is then an invitation to understand why are autocrats using these so-called transitional justice tools and for what end? And so we develop in the paper a typology of types of autocratic truth commissions. Self-investigating commissions, which are intended to minimize the exposure of the existing leader to strengthen their symbolic authority. And then rival investigating commissions that are designed to expand exposure of one's predecessors and rivals such that they are not, they are no longer politically viable. And so this is just one of the ways that erstwhile democratic or human rights institutions are being used to consolidate autocrats' power. What's interesting and what's troubling and why it's important that we investigated this type of institution and that scholars continue to pay attention to them is that these have been supported in some instances by global north countries, by development agencies thinking that it is true transitional justice. And so the 2 examples that we use in the paper after providing a cross-national discussion is Uganda. So Idi Amin creates a truth commission to investigate disappearances under his regime, and Truth Commission does its work. It basically says Idi Amin, and no one at the top was responsible. And, you know, some of these people who were disappeared, you know, were bad people. And so it totally equivocates on the question. So that one provided essentially some relief for Idi Amin because he was seen as doing something, even though it was substantially nothing. Second one is by Yoweri Museveni, who is still president of Uganda and has been since 1986. So he creates a truth commission to investigate abuses by all of his predecessors, and this is funded by, among others, the Danish International Development Agency, DENIDA. And so you have, you know, international actors supporting TJ processes, or what they think are TJ processes, without a serious interrogation into whose interest they might be serving and how we can even detect some of these issues from the design of the mandate, the operation of the commission, and its outputs and outcomes. And so I think that is a major challenge. Autocrats using regular courts and electoral institutions to co-opt opposition members. These are using erstwhile democratic institutions. We need to be on the watch for that. Second thing, shifting very quickly to international law and courts, is a major threat to democracy around the world and to human rights around the world is the very architecture of the international legal system. So our first speaker talks about how this is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. There were no African countries that were represented when the UDHR was being written. In fact, most of Africa was under colonial rule, and it was colonial powers, France, Germany, and others, who were the ones determining what would be human rights. Now, I believe in universal human rights, and I believe in the rights that are enshrined in that particular declaration. But the point is that for too long, certain perspectives and experiences have been marginalized within international organizations, and the system has been tilted to favor the privileged, and in particular, white majority nations, in ways that are fundamentally unequal and fundamentally problematic. I'll shift not only to the structure of international law and organization, but very importantly to major powers within this context, right? So you have, for example, China, which holds a veto on the UN Security Council, trying to create illiberal IOs outside of the auspices of the United Nations. We have Russian aggression in Ukraine and war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide, not only in Ukraine, but elsewhere. With the United States, you have the refusal of jurisdiction of the court over U.S. personnel for suspected abuses in Afghanistan. But interesting, because the U.S. is not a member state, but interestingly, the U.S. thinks it's totally fine for the ICC to investigate Russia in Ukraine, even though Russia, like the United States, is a non-member of the court. And so you have a situation of law for thee, but not for me. And that is fundamentally corrosive to the international rule of law. It creates amazing opportunities for propagandists to say that the system is rigged, it's not designed for us, it's meant to serve the powerful, because it is, but that doesn't mean we should dismantle the system or get rid of it. It just needs to be reformed such that states are held accountable for their actions, regardless of their size, regardless of their nuclear weapons arsenal, regardless of their Security Council vetoes. And just last, because the ICJ came up in the last session, whatever comes out of the International Court of Justice with respect to the dispute between Russia and Ukraine, the enforcement arm of the ICJ is the UN Security Council, where Russia holds a key veto. So again, just further evidence of how slanted the international system is, how it aids and abets impunity by the powerful, and in many instances seeks to impose its will on the powerless.
And how do I turn it on?
It's on.
See, I'm a poor guy from Jordan. I don't know how to deal with these things. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone.
Assalamualaikum salam.
It's such a pleasure to be back here to UConn, to the Dodd Center for Human Rights. I've had the pleasure of working for the Political Science Department and the Human Rights Institute. And I still have the pleasure of continuing working for UConn through the Global Affairs under the leadership of Daniel Wiener. And one of the great initiatives and work we've done is the Abrahamic initiatives years before the Abrahamic Accord was signed. Now, what's been presented is too much sophisticated, and I have no plan of coping it. And I'll just be, saying what I want to say. I'm not sure if I'm going to say it at the very end or not, but the framing of the question at hand. And as you know, I'm coming from a region that is the most democratic and the most respected for human rights is the Middle East. And it is the most peaceful place as well. So my task is very simple. But before getting into that, and I have a few questions, I'm inviting you to be part of the discussion. And I think they're basic, but we tend to forget about basic questions. And the first and the most important one is human nature. Human nature and human behavior. And I'm struggling to understand why people do what they do. In politics, in personal life, in society, and otherwise. And what is it in power that very few ruling elites would like to share and inviting people into it? Well, political scientists, sociologists, psychologists, and other specialists try to provide so much insight and explanation, yet human beings still behaving the way they did thousands of years ago, compromising their own existence and violating rights of their fellow human beings on a daily basis. I think this big, huge question we need all to reflect on. So this would be my first intervention, or remark, if you wish. And I will be also sharing with you some of the more sophisticated theoretical treatment of democracy. And here I'll cite the political philosopher, the French, Jacques Attali, who considers democracy to be in danger worldwide. In Africa, for example, democracy has blurred in people's minds due to new forms of colonization. In the United States, there is a growing fear of rising populism, human rights repression, and declining separations of powers. In Europe, illiberal democracies prioritizes participation and representation over individual rights and freedoms. In countries like India and Turkey, democracy coexists with social systems that perpetuate exclusion, control, social inequality, and minority rights violations, raising questions about their true democratic nature. And that's the global atlas of what is happening around the globe. Now, Attali's observation is supported by several cases and empirical evidence. Yet, to many minds, democracy remains the optimal political system to ensure people's freedoms, rights, and ability to choose institutions. However, since its inception, democracy has faced three fundamental challenges. First, the internal tension between the idea of popular participation and individual freedoms. Popular participation is the cornerstone of democracy, and individual freedoms is the basis of liberal values. This tension questions modern liberal societies since participation may infringe on individual freedoms. Modern democratic thinkers tend toward a social contract theory, expressing participation in the form of abstract and limited legal consensus. When democracy is reduced to participation without the framework of individual freedoms and rights, it loses its true liberating force, which is individual self-awareness. Yet, if it becomes a true utilitarian coalition of independent individuals, as extreme liberals' tendencies suggest, it loses its objective foundation, the collective will that underpins the state. So this is a serious tension that we have to pay attention to. The other one is And I think this is remarkable. It's the tension between procedural legitimacy and substantive legitimacy, ethics and the law. Democratic ideas stem from intellectual and cultural diversity in society, making it impossible to establish political and civic consensus on core values and beliefs, as effectuated previously. Consequently, legitimacy in democratic systems becomes procedural, relying on legal tools, ensuring civil peace and common coexistence without addressing individual morals and ideological considerations. This leads to a form of unjustifiable control over individual consciousness, separating religious and moral beliefs from individual freedoms and pluralisms. Habermas, for example, noted that procedural legitimacy tends to suppress individual freedoms. Public discourse should encompass all perspectives based on rational argumentation. And here come rules about public reasoning and the accommodating of a comprehensive doctrines. Thirdly, the tension between local, national dimensions in democracy and the universal human aspects of freedom and participation. This challenge has become prominent with the decline of nation-state model and the setback of absolute national sovereignty. The debate now focuses on whether the nation-state is the sole horizon for liberal democracy or whether the post-national era opens broader avenues for democracy. Now, all of these tensions, obviously, is calling for our own attention to revise what had happened to democracy and the democratic deal over the last 3 centuries. Now, regarding the question of the assault on human rights and the declining democracy, I think there is a kind of consensus with no objection to that. There is a global decline. There is a declining trend in democracy where there are less states who are ruled by democratic regimes and less individuals living under democratic regimes. But why that is the case, how we got there, we're comparing declining to what peak, where it was not declining. So there was a peak, there was a rising, and then declining. Why did all of that did happen, and how that has to do with politics domestically and internationally? One also of the debate is about liberal national domestic politics and the illiberal international politics. That is the delusion of the great delusion, according to Mearsheimer. And of course, the debate about whether we should focus on procedures or on the value system of democracy. And I tell you, for example, where I'm coming from, the Middle East, definitely all democracies are concerned with the procedures, with mechanisms, with, putting electoral systems, political party systems, voting systems to no avail at the core of the serious, real democratic values like freedoms, rights, and free speech to express people's preferences over the competing parties and individuals. And this is a serious issue that we have to deal with when we're talking about the Middle East in a minute. Now again, in democracy, in democratization, she raises this for 1 minute. I need to accept, sorry. Questions of the socio-economic prerequisites, Lipset, we all know. And then the transitioning to democracy or democratic system, consolidating, quality of democracy, death or survival of democracy. And there is the questions of why nations fail, or making democracy work, or how democracies survive, or why democracies die. And they all come to 3 important answers. The first is, and I think it is very important, institutions. When societies fail to build institutions and improve institutions, then they cannot sustain democracy or democratic processes. The other one that is not in the mainstream thinking, which is what I call the cementing the society, the glue of society, which is the social trust. When people lose trust in each other, democracies fail and nations fail. Now, if I to share with you numbers, we do survey at the institutions that are running in Jordan. A social trust in the Arab world is the lowest in the entire world. People do not trust each other. And the lack of trust is vertical and horizontal. People don't trust public institutions, nor they trusting each other. The third, of course, would be leadership. Who governs? Think of Turkey before Erdogan and after Erdogan. Think of Eastern Europe before certain leaders and after certain leaders. Think of China. So leadership does matter. And, well, let's go back to Machiavelli and others. They changed the course of history. And they changed democratic regimes from democratic to non-democratic. The most important one that I'm going to stop talking about it now, later I'll come to it, is the American foreign policy. The American intervention in the region is a major reason, causal, for the declining democracy in the Middle East. And I'll explain that in my second intervention. Thank you.
First of all, thank you to the University of Connecticut for the opportunity to be in this amazing panel. And after that last phrase by my colleague Zaid, I feel like I come in a moment after a bomb has just been dropped in this audience. Being in this building and seeing the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights all around the building, I think that we do have to recall something that has already been signaled by my co-panelists, including by Alice on video. And this is the inextricable link between democracy and human rights. So I think that Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is something that we all need to bear in mind, because it is the article that does set forth that the will of the people is the basis for any authority's government, and it must be expressed in periodic and genuine elections through secret vote and universal possibility to vote in an equal manner. So, as all my colleagues have mentioned, in the global context, democracy is in assault. All the reports the main reports of International IDEA, for example, of the Economist Intelligence Unit, and all other reports regarding democracy do identify that more than half of the world's democracies are actually in retreat nowadays. My identity is Latin American. I'm half Ecuadorian and half Mexican. And I have been asked to speak on Latin America and on the Latin American challenges in democracy. So following Said's very good example, first of all, I will say buenas tardes, which means good afternoon to all of you. And also following Said's good example, I will use sarcasm. So Latin America, there's no corruption at all. Elections are transparent, rulers are very good, so no, that's not the case. So in Latin America, authoritarian regimes, 15 years ago, Cuba was considered the only authoritarian regime in the region. And now, in the last reports that I've mentioned, in the 2022 reports, now we have added to this list, 2022, we have added Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti, okay? So besides from these authoritarian regimes, and as some of you might know, in Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro has been repressing opposition since 2008, since it won elections in 2018, and supposedly new elections will come up in 2024, and supposedly they will be democratic. This remains to be seen. In Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega managed to reform the constitution, and he has still been in power for many years. There are now some countries that have been added to what has been called by The Economist hybrid regimes, or by some other indexes, low-quality democracies. So as hybrid regimes, we see El Salvador, El Salvador is one of the main challenges to democracy, or the main backslides in democracy in the region recently, because Nayib Bukele, who's actually a president that has a very strong support, it has more than 70% of public support, because of a regime of exception he has installed in El Salvador to combat organized crime, the maras, the gangs. And with this regime of exception, where some fundamental human rights have been suppressed, he has been able to diminish crime in a very significant way. Around 70,000 people have been put in prison in El Salvador, which is a tiny country. They have been put in prison because of this regime of exception. And so society is actually happy with the results regarding crime and regarding the higher levels of security than before. However, this leads for Nayib Bukele to want to re-elect himself, going against the Constitution. So the Constitution actually is very clear in 5 articles that governments, presidential governments in El Salvador last for 5 years, and that presidents should not be able to be reelected. But he is actually making use of an unclear use of the language in one of these articles that says that the president in the immediately earlier period should not be reelected. So he says, oh, that means my predecessor because I'm still in office. So he's actually running for re-election. And so we have elections in El Salvador next year with the president running for re-election, trying to perpetuate his mandate, a mandate that does have public support, which is the irony. So this is El Salvador. Another regime that has been qualified as hybrid is Guatemala, where, yes, we just had elections in Guatemala. Bernardo Arevalo won, but the 2 leading political opposing candidates were actually impeded to run for presidents right before the election because of accusations of corruption by the judicial authority. Bolivia, Paraguay, Ecuador, where, as you know, the presidential candidate of the Correa leftist government was actually killed a few days before the presidential election. So the second runner-up of that party came into office. This political candidate that was assassinated, he had a strong line against organized crime. So probably organized crime was involved here. And so now we just had elections and the right wing won in these elections. And in Mexico, where we have elections coming up, this is also called a hybrid regime or a low quality democracy, where we have elections coming up in 2024, where we have a president in office who is constantly attacking the autonomous electoral body, trying to reduce its budget, trying to make it disappear through constitutional reforms, and where the morning press that he has every morning is being used by the president to attack political opposition and to favor his own party. So these are all called hybrid regimes by some of the barometers, and all the other states in Latin America are called imperfect democracies. So having said that, the biggest backsliding in 2022 was in Brazil because of the Bolsonaro difficulties to transition towards the government of Lula, and also El Salvador, the problems of which I have mentioned already. So to be brief, we can't, most of the political analysts say that we can't really speak today of a leftist, rightist division in Latin America, because actually what we have seen historically in Latin America is a trend where people are not happy with current governments, and so opposition wins, and vice versa. So between the 80s and the 90s, the last 2 decades of last century, we had mostly weak governments. Many did not finish their mandates. The economic situation was not good. Leftist opposition was doing even hostile acts against rightist governments in place. And then because of this, 66% of the elections in these decades were won by the opposition. Then in the beginning of the 2000s until 2019 approximately, we saw a shift. So only 44% of the elections were won by the opposition in Latin America, because governments had benefited from a period of stable economy where they were able to put in place some reforms, and that had people happy. there were, of course, some coups, like in 2009, a coup that was successful in Honduras. And so here, there's a beginning of a trend that's worrisome and that's still of concern today, where governments in power start to control electoral and judicial bodies in Latin America. And then we can speak about the cycle that started in 2019, where of the 15 presidential elections that were carried out between 2019 and 2022, in all of them but one, because it was a farce, it was a Nicaragua election where actually Ortega won again. In all of these elections, the opposition won. So people were not happy with the governments in place, and they had this vote to punish officialist governments, okay? So now, from 2021 to 2024, what we are seeing in Latin America is what we call an electoral super cycle, where 17 countries of the region will actually have elections to have a new president in place in the frame between 2021 and 2024, in the midst of a pandemic, of an economic recession almost, of an increase, almost 32% increase in general poverty, 13% increase in extreme poverty in our region, of course, corruption, organized crime, which is always present in our region, and an increase in social protests. So in this year, we've seen a few elections. Paraguay, where the officialist party did win, again. Guatemala, which I have already mentioned. And Argentina, we are just passing the first round of elections, and we are going to a second round where Massa is actually high in the votes, center-left, but where we have, as a second runner-up, Milei, which is an ultra-right conservative, very extreme ideology. So basically in 2024, we have a lot of elections coming up, presidential elections in El Salvador, Panama, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Uruguay, and Venezuela. So what do I see as the main challenges? I will just mention the main challenges and the main ways I think human rights can tackle these challenges. So first of all, there is a hyperpolarization in the region. For those of you who are familiar with Jim Waller's work and the relevance of social fragmentation and of polarization as a risk to generate mass atrocities, I think we are in the presence of a very dangerous situation. In Mexico, for example, the president himself, ever since he came into power, has divided society and all his morning presses with a term that in Spanish we call chairos, which is slang to say leftist red, and fifis, which is slang to say conservative or high level in society. So he's actually equating your socioeconomic status with your political ideology, which we all know is a false dichotomy. And he's actually encouraging society to use these terms. And we see it in youth, we see it in everybody is now identified as one or the other extreme. So polarization is a very risky factor in these political processes. This is completely related to hyperfragmentation, social fragmentation in society. Politicians in power are putting in place anti-democratic measures to perpetuate their power. And so we see attacks against the autonomous electoral bodies. Mexico is a case where the president tried to disappear the autonomous electoral body. And when he wasn't able to through a constitutional reform, he tried to decrease its budget, for example, and to disappear some of its organs. Fake news and the role of social media in this, and the role of technology and digital aspects. And there is also a higher indifference towards democracy. Besides from this polarization, there's a higher indifference towards democracy, according to some of the polls. The Latino Barometer is one of these polls, where a worrying trend in some people who say, as long as the government solves my problems, I don't care if it's an authoritarian regime. Right? So this, in the midst of restrictive laws of human rights, intimidation of the press, attacks on courts and electoral bodies, increase in social discontent, etc. So I think that I will leave the options of how human rights can fix this to a more positive note to the debate. So thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you. And Mariana, that was a perfect queuing up for the second round of questions, which we'll again take in turn. And I just want to underscore that, some of what I heard are themes that we're going to take up very robustly tomorrow as well, but in the context of thinking about democracy and illiberalism in the United States. So for those who are here, please join us again tomorrow when I think some of these very same ideas are going to be discussed throughout the entire, remainder of the program in the U.S. context. But between Harsh's comments and the rest of the panel, I was really struck by a phrase that he invoked early on, and that was the use of fear, unfreedom, violence, and hate as key ingredients to heightened illiberalism and control. I heard the notion of social fragmentation, which comes to us in part because of Jim Waller's work, and Zaid, in your comments around the value system of democracy, really needing to have more interrogation. Kelly, I find it quite stunning to think about a fight about what truth means in truth commissions and the way in which these are used as supposedly tools for promoting democracy, and yet can then also be tools that I think further indifference toward democracy within broader publics. So really, the ways in which your talks threaded together was quite profound. I would like you to reflect, and I know we don't have a lot of time before we go to audience questions, but could you reflect on what actions or processes can counter such social fragmentation, discouragement, even despair about democratic institutions and democracy as an idea? How can these institutions be shored up and perhaps even restored, not to some mythic idealist past, but maybe an idea that could be even stronger than what we've imagined in previous generations? That's a lot of questions already, and you may not want to take them all up, but the last dimension is, do you see a role for ordinary individuals? And I purposefully do not use the word citizen. I mean ordinary individuals within these nation-state boundaries, sometimes crossing these boundaries in trying to do this work.
Thanks. Those were great. I think we got a picture of a world in tumult. I believe we are passing through what is nothing short of a civilizational crisis. We are recognizing increasingly the crisis to the planet from of climate, to some degree of inequality. But the third crisis is, how do we deal with what we perceive to be difference? How do we live together with the chances that we will be living in a world where the chances that your neighbor will not look like you, worship like you, eat like you, dress like you, speak your language is higher and higher. So do you deal with this person with friendship and curiosity and welcome, or are you resentful and fearful and hateful? And I think we're seeing around the world more and more people in country after country are choosing leaders who are encouraging us to be hateful. So I think one central conversation has to be, how do we fight hate? And I think I'd really like to underline, it would take a long time, but just to leave a thought which both Gandhi and Martin Luther King underlined, that if you fight hate with hate, hate is only going to deepen. So how do we fight hate in ways that do not hate? So can you have a politics which is actually founded on love? And this is not. It's not an an idea that is impractical. I think it is the only way that we can move ahead. In the way, for instance, Mandela chose to move after apartheid. So what is a new politics of love and that we build between ourselves? What is a new social contract? And we used to often, I think we always talked about for many centuries, democracy being founded on liberty, equality and fraternity. But I think we don't even understand what fraternity is, and we practice it even less. Fraternity is a problem because it means brotherhood, and what about sisterhood? But in our own constitution in India, the Hindi word is bandhuta, which actually means we are bound to and with each other. That whatever you might be of a different religion, a different identity, you might have a different way of life, but we are bound to and with each other. That that if there are chains on your feet, I feel that my freedom has been stolen from me. If you're beaten on your back, I feel the pain on mine. I see your heart is full of sadness and despair. Tears come from my eyes. It is really that framework that we have to find to fight all of these crises. And one last thing, say when we saw the rising hate in my own country and the silence of the large majority and the leadership, I made a call for what I called a caravan of love. And we said we would go to the home of every person who has lost somebody to hate violence and lynching, but we won't even go as human rights workers or fact finders. We'd go like you'd go to a loved one. And you'd say, you're not alone, we share in your pain, we seek forgiveness for what we've become as a people. We pledge to be with you whatever happens, and as you fight for justice, and we will tell your story. And it was profound what the impact of this. We've now made 35 journeys. Sadly, the hate violence also continues. Promise the last thing was, I just wanted to quote Noam Chomsky, where he was speaking about social protection, but I think it's something more profound. He said social protection is the idea that we should take care of each other. And I truly believe that we'll have to look into a world where we find ways to take care of each other, and to recognize the equal humanity and value of every life. And to say something a little problematic, every life lost to horrific violence in Israel, as much as every life lost to horrific violence in Palestine, needs to cause us equal grief. And over the conversations of last evening, I kept waiting to hear the word Palestine, and I did not. And I heard it once in the morning, and it had to be a Muslim student who said it, and there was a gasp of horror which also passed through the room. We're losing our way. Every child who is killed by hate violence is equally precious to us, regardless of their identity, regardless of their religion. I think a social contract built on the idea of taking care of each other, of the equal value of every life, is the only way ahead.
Hard to top that, so I won't try, but I will affirm. I think, how do we fix all our problems in the time that we have left before Q&A? So I believe very much in the power of democracy and human rights. I think an ongoing challenge is when democracies do not exercise or practice human rights, because that makes then the idea of democracy cheap and makes it hard to advocate for it in different parts of the world, right? So democratic publics can elect leaders that are going to advance policies contrary to human rights. So, Beth Simmons in 2009 in her book, I think on page 25, I've read this book so many times, democracies are the natural allies of human rights, but democracies can also violate rights. this democracy after 9/11 started surveilling its public, started arbitrarily detaining people, started torturing people, all in the name of the security of the democracy. So I think we really must interrogate this assumption of these things going together and press our governments, our elected officials, our civic leaders and others to assure that human rights is what derives from democracy, so that to not make it cheap. Because in the process of building the post-World War II international legal order, democracies like the United States put it on themselves that they would be a shining beacon on a hill and that the rest of the world should follow in their example, which is fine if they were doing good democratic things and doing good human rights things. But when you ask people, countries, to follow a model, and they are seeing abuses domestically in that country, they are seeing abuses internationally by that country, they are seeing democratically elected governments being overthrown by that country, it makes it really hard to sell democracy. It makes democracy cheap. So I believe in many ways, I wrote in I think it was the 50th anniversary edition of Foreign Policy magazine, that democracy starts at home and human rights likewise starts at home. And so if the US is going to be part of meaningful changes in this world, it has to be making meaningful changes here at home, extending the franchise, extending rights protections, extending repair in cases of violations. Democracy has to deliver. I think that's another thing too. And democracies, especially these powerful ones, Western democracies, have to deliver on the promise that they have sold the rest of the world. So what does this entail? It means treating countries as equal. Not law for thee, but not for me, right? And on our Supreme Court justice building here in the States, right? It's equal justice under law. And so when any country is accused of serious breaches of international law, personnel in that country should be held accountable. It does not matter how powerful your country is. It does not matter how powerful your friends are. We cannot countenance breaches of international law. That is the very backbone of the international system. Likewise, and echoing Harsh, we must also then treat civilian populations under attack as equal. There is no human life that is more valuable than another. There are no human lives that are dispensable. All are precious and must be protected because we are human. We have fundamental human rights and we have fundamental dignity. And that means, to Harsh's point, that we must grieve equally the loss of human life, that we must prevent with as much vigor and energy loss of life, regardless of whatever division and a set of people may be on relative to another. And we need to just put humanity first. Put humanity first, without exception, without equivocation. If democracies cannot deliver on that, if international organizations led by powerful nations, many of them democracies, cannot deliver on that, we are truly at risk of a civilizational crisis.
This is powerful. And I certainly love the discourse of human rights and the international law, and we should all inspire of equal implementation. But at the very end, I'm from a real politique, and real politics is different, unfortunately, and we have to try to find solutions to the problem of declining democracy and violation of human rights within the framework of real politics. And that is even much more harder because, you know, whether we like it or not, the international system is not centralized. the world order is governed by powers, and powers decide for the rest. And even within our domestic politics, we see more powerful segments of the society get their ways with violation than others. So definitely we have always to insist on implementing equally the international norms and law, building more institutions domestically, internationally, and more mechanisms to ensure that all human beings are equal and should be treated equally regardless. Now, while saying that and pushing it, we have also to think of other ways to accommodate violations of human rights, declining democracies, oppressions practiced over people on daily basis in all parts of the world almost. And I just wanted to remind you to think of refugees, for example. What's happening to those refugees? How's their lives imagined and practiced and lived? All these vulnerable groups in societies. I'll tell you an example from Jordan, for example, where more than 1.5 million Syrian refugees is in Jordan. Only 700,000 of them is registered with the UNHCR. And the states, international organizations, they don't know about the others. They are not recipients of any kind of aid. So just imagine what we do to those. That's only a small portion of the Syrians who left Syria forced to be refugees in Jordan. Just think of Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, and other places. So what I'm trying to say, reflecting on the larger context of democracy and human rights in the Middle East, that real politics decides, and it is decides people's lives and fates. And we've been only, and I'm going to use this word, selling false dreams to the people. People of the region talking today about double standards. The meaningful American role in promoting democracy and protecting human rights is absolutely not a point in the region. On the contrary, actually, the United States and United States policies and politics is the example why people are shying away from democracy and human rights and praising more stronger regimes and leaders. Think of Erdogan one more time. Think of Iran. Think of other countries. It's precisely because the hypocrisies, the double standards, the lack of supporting those who need. What are you going to tell Syrians? When the Americans left them to die, 2013 because of the red lines. While in Libya, the Americans just with the NATO just bombed Gaddafi and took him out. Oil is important, much more important than people, much more important. Same today with Algeria, for example. You people had fought so many years in order to change the regime in Algeria, and when they did, comes the problem of the lack of gas supplies to Europe, and Algeria is there. To hell with the human rights. We support the regime in Algeria, regardless of violation of human rights, to ensure the gas supply to Europe. Now think of the Gulf. All Gulf countries. Americans, Europeans, Western democracies sleeping together with the Gulf regimes, despite the fact that the records of human rights and democracy is the lowest ever. How are you going to explain that to the people of the region? And now I'll give one more time. You will have, you have to invade Iraq based on all lies and false accusation, and invading Iraq in order to bring democracy to Iraq, only to deliver Iraq to ISIS, Daesh, and Iran, your main enemy in the region. So when I said the main reason why there is no full working democracy, reasonable level of democracy and respect for human rights, is because of the Americans' strategies, what we call the sins of American politics. Now I understand the logic of strategic action and interaction in the world order. I understand how states calculate, including the United States, where our national interests are much more important, and morally you have to serve your national interest. But speaking different languages, applying double standards is not helping the case. So the best thing is just to leave people decide on the way they want to govern themselves and the way to coexist together. And should be maybe more powerful way to promote democracy and just let people deal with their own problems without imposing on them certain values and norms while you are promoting the very same values and norms on daily basis as well. Just want also to share with you the idea of and I'm talking about Arab countries. Arab countries facing three problems. Now, the American policies and strategy in the region only deepen them. The first is the legitimacy. There is no each country or state in the region enjoy full legitimacy. And that's dangerous. The second is identity crisis. All Arab countries, each Arab country faces identity crisis. People don't know who are they, what to do. And, the politics of the otherness, to borrow Edward Said one more time, is a serious issue. And using politics of identity to ensure regimes' control and elites' control and unholy alliances' control of resources and wealth and influence is a serious issue. That's the marginalization, that's the fragmentation, and that's all the source of all illnesses in the regime and in the society. And the third one, of course, would be security. There is no single state secured. They live in fear. And because of that fear, because they want to ensure their survival, the regimes, they one more time turn into this lack of legitimacy, compensated by all corruption methods, and for this identity and exploiting it against people's interest and the state and society interest. There are so many things to say, but and I want to remind you also with the war against terrorism. That's not only did surveillance inside the States and Europe, but also gave, a check to all, just free, green light for all Arab regimes to whatever they want to do with their dissidents and their citizens in order to make sure that they are part of the war against terrorism. Now, all of that is reflected in their new cyber law that they just passed, where, basically, what they say it in the Arab region, it is forbidden for you to breathe. That might be a crime. Now, I'm not getting into torture. I'm not getting to women's rights. You know what's the gender gap in their world is? Because of these regimes and because of these practices? And do you see any American, for example, program that conditioned any aid to any regime, any support to any regime, by filling in this gap and dealing with these violations? Is totally in the contrary. There is no talk about democracy or human rights or freedoms. It's talk about stability and security, serving regime's interest and state's interest. All right, I'll stop here.
Well, regarding Latin America, I want to start with a positive note, which is that despite all these assaults on democracy that we've seen in our region, what we have seen is that particularly young people are organizing themselves beyond political parties, and they are manifesting themselves and protesting, and this has had some effect in all these attempts against democracy. So this is something that when we speak about how can human rights be used to counter all these bad tendencies, definitely raising one's voice and protesting is a very strong tool for this. In Mexico, where I live, and this is just an example, when the president was trying to, what I told you, to reduce the budget of the National Electoral Organ and to eliminate its autonomy, there were very big protests on the street. And those protests were actually led by the councillors that formed a part of this national electoral body, which were actually, they were putting their positions at risk. And that helped. That social pressure helped, and the reforms did not pass in Mexico. This is not the case, however, in many other countries. So we do need to keep raising our voices, and we need to guarantee the autonomy of electoral bodies. Some countries have only one electoral body, others divide it in the body that organizes the elections and the body that's the tribunal that resolves electoral judicial disputes. Both of these need to be absolutely autonomous from the executive. And this is not the case in many countries. In many countries, it is actually the president who is, through the assembly or the parliament, controlling these bodies in order for them to rule in their favor. That is how, in El Salvador, Bukele is going to be able to re-elect himself, because of a ruling by the judicial power. That was put in place, judges or magistrates put in place by his own political party. So this is something, the autonomous character of electoral bodies is essential to guarantee democracy. Also, electoral bodies themselves have to know their role and have to measure how they react and when they react. I had the opportunity to participate this year as a panelist in the Inter-American meeting of electoral bodies organized by the Organization of American States. And Gerardo Monk, he's an Argentinian expert who teaches at USC. He used an example that I think was very interesting. I'm a lawyer, so for me all these political topics are quite new. But he said to these electoral bodies, you have to know that when you watch a soccer match, if after the match everyone is speaking more about the referee than the match itself, that's a failed match. So the electoral bodies also have to know when to act, when it's too much and when it's too little. Because you don't want to create a political enemy from the government, but also you can't stay silent, right? So this, I thought it was a very precise example of some cases in my region where the role has not been accurate. Of course, we have to still combat the levels of polarization, of social fragmentation, and this comes from the ordinary person, as Kathy mentioned, right? All of us. If we don't do this at home, we can't do it in society. Finally, I think that it's very important to understand that there are mechanisms in place to protect democracy, and those mechanisms need strengthening. You know, there are electoral observatories, both domestic but also international, by the Organization of American States, by European Union, for example. In my region, they come and they observe elections in order to ensure their transparency. Some countries still don't accept international electoral observatory missions. Countries that you wouldn't even imagine, they don't accept them. Right? So this is something we need to strengthen. And also in the Inter-American region, we have the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which says that, which also reinforces this link between democracy and human rights. So multilateralism, although I know that the international system is flawed, and it is a power system. I'm also in the realpolitik sphere, and as a lawyer, I think we should use the mechanisms that we have. But for that, we need to create a regional consensus about the need for democracy. Unfortunately, in Latin America, this consensus does not exist nowadays because of all these states that are walking away from democracy as something acceptable in order to guarantee security or combat organized crime. Thank you.
We have time for 2 questions, and then there's plenty of opportunity to engage following. But if we could take 2 questions, and then the panelists can respond to either or both in turn. We thank you.
Well, thank you so much. My first question is, I have only one question, and I'll be very happy if all the panelists answer it, but I am posing this question to Dr. Eyadat. Eyadat? Yes. Okay. And So I wanted first, before I ask my question, I wanted to problematize what you said about intervention, like the U.S. intervention is the only the only and one reason for the lack of democracy in the Middle East. I think this is very wrong, and I'm very amazed that I really hear it from a social or political scientist from the Middle East. And again, I'm talking from an Iranian perspective, and I think it's important because Iran plays a very important role in forming the politics in the Middle East, in destabilizing the Middle East and having political power over other nations and the states in the Middle East. And when we are talking about Iran, and particularly Iranian government, we need to know that it's a country and it's a state that is being called out for human rights violations all over the world. And for civil society shut down, and for the killing of the protesters, and for harsh violations of human rights. I don't know if you have a paradise in Jordan or other Arab countries, but when we talk about a Persian country, or a very important country in the Middle East, with a long history of resistance, revolutions, and also horrific violations of human rights. We need to be very careful, like really, really careful to say that the United States or the wider Western world is the only reason for democracy shut down, particularly in a country like Iran or for instance in Turkey, which we are dealing with religious fundamentalists in power. The constitution is written based on the patriarchal and misogynistic interpretations of Islamic text. And this is not only my critique, but also Muslims. Also, the Muslim critics go against all these patriarchal interpretations of Islam that is being imposed by the religious fundamentalists, causing wars in the Middle East, victimizing Palestinians, establishing wars, proxy wars with Israel, and destabilize. So when you think about and talk about democracy, we're talking about the rule of people. People have no meaning in Middle Eastern countries. People are all walking death. So the power is in the hands of the fundamentalists, and we need the entire world's support. We just had a revolution in Iran that was shut down because of no attention. So this is dangerous. I'm so sorry, but very dangerous, and you need to be careful when you talk to students.
Okay, I'm so sorry. We're toward the end of this very rich session, and thank you very much for your contribution. We're going to take one other question, and then we'll have the panelists say a closing thought in response to either of the questions or something that they've elicited.
Okay.
Hi, Fernando Valenzuela, graduate student here at the School of Social Work. I first want to say thank you all so much for speaking. I didn't think I was going to make it without the coffee, and hearing all of you speak really exhilarated me way more than caffeine, and I'm really inspired by the courageousness that I've seen you display by being so critical and saying the things that you said. Okay, I'll try and keep it brief, but it's a pretty big question. Something that really resonated with me was the U.S. foreign intervention and policy. And what I was thinking about was how I feel like here in the United States, these ideas of democracy and human rights are inextricably connected to militarism, to this kind of foreign policy. And I totally agree that human rights needs to start at home. And as an American, as a future social worker, I think about the implications of foreign policy on the rest of the world, particularly the global South. So I'm really struggling with how we separate the idea of democracy and human rights here in the United States from a bloated military budget that will likely be $1 trillion in my lifetime, and that is ultimately profitable, right? Weapons manufacturing stocks have gone up in recent weeks, and that's probably not going to change. So my very loaded question is, how do we start to make that distinction and separation between human rights and democracy and the ways that the United States has historically done that? Thank you.
So a very concise answer and response from each of you for your closing comment. You can start, Zaid.
Let me start. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and this is how I'm going to close it. Well, thank you very much for your intervention and comments. They're very profound.
Sorry, it's like I didn't want to be harsh, you know. It was
Is there harsher than this? You've been harsh enough. Okay. Just joking. Just joking. Take it easy. Hold on. Let me answer you. Can I react to what you've said? And in a simple way. First, I certainly agree with you that the American foreign policy is not the only, and I never use the only. I said the main. I mentioned three other things. I talked about social trust, and I talked about the erosion of social trust in their worlds, lack of institutions or failure of institutions, and also leadership. Leadership, that's the fundamentals they're talking about. This is one. Now, American foreign policy intervention in the region is by no doubt, by all empirical evidence, is main cause for the lack of democracy. Now, I'm repeating, I'm talking about Arab countries in particular. I'll give you examples. Now, before the examples, Arab countries, whether we like it or not, are not ruled by fundamentalists. Iran, Turkey, yes, but not Jordan, not Egypt. I'll tell you, they're even hated by the people because they are too secular. So it's not only they're not fundamentalist, they're actually to the other side of the spectrum. Now, and this is much more important, there's been always talk about the compatibility proposition, whether Arab culture and Islamic culture is compatible or incompatible with the human rights and democracy. And we know this is a very Orientalist propositions. All empirical studies saying the following. And before even I say that, after they say it's an Islamic Arabic things, and then they found some Islamic states are actually more democratic than the others, and they say, well, it is not Islamic, it's an Arab problem. So there's a problem with Arab culture, that is tribalism in particular, and democracy. Well, guess what? Here comes the Arab Spring and the revolutions. And most of the Arab countries, the people are in the street chanting and changing regimes, calling for democracy and human rights. Only and only years, less than a year or 2 years, the Americans supported the counter-revolutions in all Arab countries only to strengthen more autocratic regimes in the region. Thank you. Right.
because Middle East is very diverse politics.
Right. That's why I say Arabs.
And Iran is in transition.
So I leave the US aside. I was just responding to something I think Zaid said, which I'm not sure is, the distinction between realpolitik and what we were proposing. I was proposing, can we imagine, have a radical new imagination of the way we live together, a new social contract based on the idea that we belong to and with each other and must take care of each other. So just to underline that it's not at all unrealistic, I wanted to give just one brief example. This was Christchurch, New Zealand, in 2019. And my favorite leader across the world, Jacinda Ardern, what was her immediate response? This guy had gone into 2 mosques and live streamed as he shot dead people who were worshipping on Friday. Her first response was exactly what we do in the Karwan, was to go to the people who had been affected, and she embraced them and shared in their pain. Next, what did she do? She said, I will never name, we don't know the name of that young man. She said, I never name this man because he is not us. The people he killed was us, and it was just 2% recent migrants who were Muslims. But she said they were us. So who belongs and who does not belong? Thirdly, the next Friday prayers, she made a call. The azan was sounded from every radio and news and television channel. People gathered, everybody, women covered their heads, police women, and so on, as a sign of solidarity, newswomen, Zaid. And people gathered outside each of the mosques, held hands and said, "We will stand guard while you pray in safety." The Imam, his final words were, what has happened? We are broken-hearted, but we are not broken, because New Zealand has taught us what it means to love.
The persistent power of human rights lies in individual and group mobilization. And so I don't want any of us, especially like the college students, the high school students in the room, to be totally dejected and despondent, like, look at this mess they've shown us in great detail and left us with little solution for. No. You have a lot of power to call your elected representatives to vote, to protest, to donate to causes that matter to the people who are the hands and feet who are on the ground, that are helping to do the work of human rights defense in different parts of the world, and even indeed in these United States. It's only impossible until it's done. So while the challenges might seem insurmountable, we have to, do our level best to make that effort. There's no special reason that Mandela was released from prison in 1992. It could have been 3 years earlier, could have been 4 years later, right? But it was impossible until it was done. Or the internal armed conflict in Guatemala ending in 1996, or Indonesia's occupation of Timor-Leste ending in 1999 and a transitional administration being established. And so if we look to historical examples, time and again, diligent, mobilized groups of individuals have helped to unseat authoritarian governments, have helped to usher in democratic change, and set their countries on a more stable path. It's not easy, it's not straightforward. Sometimes just because you have autocratic breakdown does not mean you get democracy. You might just get another flavor of autocracy. But we have to get in the streets, get into legislatures, get into into voting booths, and anywhere and everywhere that we can exercise the power that we have.
Finally, on the role of foreign policy, I fully agree in the importance of the role of foreign policy to strengthen democracy. Just as a reminder, and this is something we've lived negatively in Mexico, for example. For a long time in international law, it was thought that the basic fundamental principles of relations between states were those set forth in the Declaration of Friendly Relations among states of the 70s. With the human rights upsurge in international law, there is no doubt today that there's an additional fundamental principle added to those, which is human rights. This is the basis for the Doctrine of Responsibility to Protect in the 2005 Declaration. And also, this is a basis for governments to not be able to turn a blind eye when a country that is a neighbor or that is like-minded or that is from our region is going through a democratic backslide. I say that we've been in a process where this has been ignored, and I give an example of Mexico, where Mexico before in the previous government used to support a regime change in Venezuela in line with the European Union and in line with other countries in the region because of the grave and serious human rights violations that were happening. And then as soon as the government changed, the foreign policy position changed to one of non-intervention. So I just want to leave this for you to understand that non-intervention is at the same level today than human rights, and that we do have a global responsibility to protect. When regime changes involve human rights violations, we do have something to do in other countries. And there's even international jurisprudence to support this. So this will be my last note.
Thank you. Thank you all for a wonderful panel. Again, thank you for your engagement. As the panelists are welcome to take their seat in the audience, I'd like to invite everyone who's making remarks for the Dodd bus dedication to come forward to the front row. We have a wonderful privilege here before we take a break to have our meal, to have a chance to dedicate a bus to Senator Christopher Dodd. So we will make the transition